Today I'm going to talk about perfection, and I'm going to talk about the double myths of perfection and precision. And one of the things that we've been seeing, what a lot of the work I do is really military, or on military, sorry. This is just like, yeah, it's like everything that goes wrong today will be like, that's another system error. And I'll be using it. I'll be, I already caught a typo the other night. I sent Steph an email going, oh no, I caught a typo. Oh, it's just another system error. Haha, I meant it. It was part of the joke. Okay, so the work I do is this work on military science, basically, which is just really the technology of the military and how that works, a lot of it. And what I want to do is look at what I call kill screens today. Now, they're just not me that calls them that. They're called kill screens, really comes from the gaming world, especially if you're familiar with the world of 80s gaming, which is probably the last time I picked up or went to an arcade to play a game was probably in the 80s at some point. I want us to think about for the moment how much we ask from our technologies, that we expect them just to work. And when they stop working, we tend to get impatient very quickly. And I think our level of impatience with our technologies when they stop functioning has gone up in the last, say, 20 years enormously. There was a time when if something didn't work with the computer, you turned it off and you went and did something else. Now, if our computers don't work, we get upset easily and quickly, and we get enraged if you've ever struggled with a machine trying to get it to work, and maybe something as simple as a printer, trying to get your printer to work, and the file won't send, and the file won't send, and the file won't send, and you say, why? Like you feel affronted. Why is this technology doing this to me? I'm such a nice person. I mean, I didn't deserve this. And we typically feel it's not our fault. I mean, the first thing I will do is, curse Epson or HP or whoever it is, and then I'll go on to curse the factory that made it, and the idiots who designed it, and the people who didn't pay workers enough to put it together properly, and and that kind of thing. So I'm going to go on looking for a problem or somebody I can blame other than me, basically. The solution for such problems is typically monetary. A couple of years ago, almost exactly at the end of a 3-year run of a small printer that I bought, which needed to do a number of different jobs, the formatter board blew, and I figured out what it was, and I did some diagnostics on it. And I'm not a technical guy at all, so I realized it said you can fix a formatter board. I was like, what's that? So I looked it up, and they said, clip the battery off the board, take the board out, and they show you how to do it. Take the board out, this is actually for real, put it in the oven, cook it, raise the temperature to blah, then you let it cool. So I was like, how does this work? Like, what? This is, the 21st century, and I'm cooking a board in the oven? Like, what is this, like Betty Crocker of the, of the 21st century? So I asked a friend of mine who is technical, and he's like, what they're doing is there's a bubble somewhere in the making of the board, somewhere in there in the circuit. The circuit has gotten bubbled, and it's just broken down because they're not putting enough metal in these circuits now because they know they're going to burn out. So what you're doing is you're reboiling, you're reheating the flux, and it's all going to smooth out again. But you have to clip the battery off or the battery will explode. And I was like, okay, so then what do you do? He said, well, then you put the battery back on, but you have to solder it back on. I'm like, you lost me at solder. I mean, like, I was done. So then I went, to Staples to get another printer, and I talked to the guy, and I got a guy who was basically, could have been one of our graduate students, or could have been, probably was. Yeah. And he did a good job, too. He sold the buck off that printer. He said, I said, okay, so I'm looking at this printer. This seems to be the same version of the thing I got, except now it's called a 1530 instead of the one I had is a 1520. He's like, that's right. I said, so it's like 3 years older. And it's the same piece of crap, right? He's like, it's right. And I said, it's going to cost me $100 more. He's like, right. I said, what if I bring you this one back? He's like, I'll give you 25 bucks for that. I'm like, sweet. That won't buy me anything. It's like, why don't you go and have a nice lunch? So I replaced this printer with another piece of the same thing, and I'm waiting for it to die now because I put its birthday on the calendar, and it's like 1 year, 2 years, its death is coming. if you consider the latest computer that you bought, whether it's in the form of a printer or it's a 2x5 phone or one of these more recent surfboard phones that they're putting out, you know, or Samsung is putting out like a 7-inch screen. Have you seen these things? It's like you have to get a new pair of pants for that. Just carry your other pair of pants around. Or a laptop or a tablet. There's perhaps a sense of relief when you buy the thing that now you've got something which will actually run, and you can play all the games and do all the things and use all the apps that your friends have been telling you are so great. And so for about a year or so, life is good. And you forget that, you know, it's working. It's actually okay. And that system starts to upgrade and so on. And then you realize that it's not actually performing as well as it once was. And because we're now past a year, or you're getting into 15, 18 months, and you're starting to think, it doesn't look as cool as it used to. Other people have better toys, and it doesn't move as fast as it used to. And it's not just because there's stuff that you've loaded onto it. It's because the network is using different technology. The network is using different software. And your piece of technology is becoming outdated rather quickly. You know, it's becoming outdated on the principle of Moore's law. In an age of computer and network, what is called interoperability. Interoperability basically means, in the military world, it means that I take your jet, let's say Poland or Canada buys some Joint Strike Fighters, which cost about $35 million apiece. I buy one of these things, and I fly it into your airspace. It connects with your airspace because it's interoperable. So this is this concept of interoperability, where everything connects to everything else. And everything talks to the same networks and so on. Because it all runs the same software, that's the concept. The reality is that a new machine will only work as long as its processor speed and power keep up with the network, which is to say, it has to shake hands fast enough, which is, as we used to say in the genteel days of dial-up, where we talk about handshake and so on. The reality is that within 18 to 36 months, you're going to be happy to get rid of this phone because it'll be replaced. It has to be replaced because the aggravation is going to get higher and higher until you get to the point where your formatter board goes or it doesn't. And this is even more frightening or worrisome sometimes because the thing can be working perfectly, nothing's wrong with it. You might have dropped it once, but you know, it's still fine. But basically, it's just too slow. So what I'm suggesting to you now is that we live inside a cognitive dissonance where a space where we believe that whatever we have, a computer, phone, tablet, Google Glass, car, whatever it is that has computers in it, because your car now has, you know, whatever, 25 computers in it, it's the best thing ever until the next best thing ever comes along, which it's going to. We just don't admit that it will. We want it to be perfect and forever, but we also want forever, we also know, and this is the cognitive dissonance, that the length of forever is about 36 months at the most. Or it might be, say, a relationship, because sometimes I hear people say, oh yeah, I was using, when I was going out with so-and-so, #.cool, I had an iPhone 3. And then I got my iPhone 5, and now I'm dating so-and-so. So like, this is how we measure how long our machines last, you know, and relationships too. You know, you're like, oh, my relationship was as good as that phone. You know, 18 months, it's done. The problem of things then not working perfectly or quickly or ideally is solved typically by us buying into the Chinese production line, where we say, okay, well, here we're going to get stuff from you, and here we'll give you our old stuff, which is toxic and has toxic waste in it, and you'll take it apart, and we'll take the next to-be toxic thing from you. This model of expecting perfection is, I think, deadly for the planet and all of its inhabitants, some of whom happen to be us. And this is the thing, is that we always put ourselves first because we think human beings are the most important thing on the face of the planet. I don't think we are. We just take a lot of pictures of ourselves. And I guess the more pictures we take, it's, you know, the more important we must be. It's even more deadly when we take this picture of perfection and you put it into a military context, which is what I want to do today. So I'm going to give you an example of perfection, which is a sort of military, sort of not form.
The games that all have something in common. They have an end to the gameplay.
There's not quite enough memory for the final board.
And it's called a kill screen because basically there's no way to finish the level. That some sort of random data or code inside the program ends up getting used for what you see on the screen. Donkey Kong is really strange in that it actually lets you play the kill screen level for maybe 5 seconds or so. Everything looks normal, and then suddenly Mario just up and dies on you.
So this concept of the kill screen, the only way you know you finished the game is basically when you hit one of these kill screens. The first screen is this one, which is made up of discontented missileers, as they're called. And so this first screen I'm going to talk about is discontented perfection and what happens with the US Air Force in our daily day. The kill screen is both a beginning and an ending. If you hit the kill screen in one of these games, it means you win the game completely, but your character dies and the operating system dies because there isn't enough time on the chip, there's enough space on the chip in these old games for it to finish its end run, and then it just freezes and then you have to reboot the game. It also marks the imperfection of the system. So the beginning is also the ending, and it also is this perfection because you've hit the highest level you possibly can in the game, and the game is also over and your character dies, which sort of all happens at the same time. This first kill screen then is a nuclear one. Given the stakes involving nuclear war and nuclear weapons, of which we still have a fantastic number on the planet, you would think that we really can't afford to have any imperfections in the nuclear weapons system. And the nuclear weapons system is an enormous sort of long snake of production from digging out uranium in Africa to basically making it into plutonium and enriching it in Tennessee and making it into pellets and so on. It's a whole world of creation there and destruction. And then just recently, as of yesterday, they store nuclear waste, this is from reactors, in salt flats. And salt flats are typically useful geologically because they're very stable. They're old oceans, so they haven't had earthquakes and that kind of thing. So unfortunately, they had a little puff of radioactive hot air that blew out of one of these salt flats the other day, and they had to close the whole site. And as of yesterday, they were like, everything is fine. But this is typical of the nuclear industry, where you don't know about stuff that's going wrong until usually after, sometimes quite a long time after. So I would hope that, given all this nuclear stuff we're talking about, in this case I'm talking about nuclear weapons, there are some 450 nuclear missile sites or silos in North America. We don't know where they are. We know that some of them are in the Cheyenne Mountains, for instance, in Colorado. You know that stuff. But the rest of them are in undisclosed locations, obviously. And I would hope that the people who are in these missile silos, so there are actually people down there. So you've got a number of missiles in the ground, and you've got people who sit in a little room, and they face a console. And if called on, they turn the key on the console and launch the weapons. Basically, that's it. But so obviously, staying at a job like this is incredibly time-consuming, incredibly boring, and it's not done by choice. People who wind up being missileers, they're called missileers, wind up being missileers because they join the Air Force, join the Air Force, see the world, and they put them in a hole in the ground, which is 100 feet down. And they're at the bottom of one of these rockets. So when the rockets take off, basically, then you've got your choice as to how you want to end your world. You can get up and go home and kill yourself. You can kill yourself right there. You can wait to be killed by a missile strike that comes in on you. Basically, it's not going to be a happy future because you just launched nuclear weapons. Okay, so these people are sitting down there, and their whole job is to turn the key when told to. Basically, that's it. And of course, if they do, it's the end of the world. So it's not much of a job. This is not the kind of job you really want to train for. Staples are looking pretty good right now. Right? And they're down at the bottom of these silos with Minuteman III missiles, and I would hope that they are an insanely devoted, anal retentive bunch with full-blown cases of OCD. I want people down there who cannot pass a gel station on the wall, a washroom, without washing their hands 5 or 10 times. I want them to be obsessive about dressing perfectly. I want them to be crazed about everything their spouse does when she or he doesn't pick up after the kids, or I want them to be completely crazed with being anal retentive, because that's what you want in somebody who has their hand on a nuclear weapon. You want somebody who is going to be incredibly careful. Unfortunately, that's not how it works, but that's what you hope for. I hope that missileers, as the Air Force calls them, would be just as obsessed, say, with the detail of the missile as an average fan is with Justin Bieber's latest bar tab and wherever he went driving last, or as Perez Hilton is with who just lost a half a pound or a half a quarter of a pound in Hollywood. I want somebody who is crazy, right, basically, with this stuff. I want to have hardcore devotees who are rule-bound fanatics who do only what they're told to unless they have to exercise common sense, in which case I'm like, yeah, please do. Unfortunately, perfection has a lot of pressure behind it because, and you know this because you're striving to meet goals. We all strive to meet goals, especially the pressure is on you if you're in school, or you're trying for LSAT scores, good LSAT scores, and so on. Well, speaking of exams, the Air Force gives its missileers a monthly test. And they must pass these tests if they're going to go on being missileers. And I'm in favor of that. I want them to pass tests. I mean, it's the kind of thing where, you know, people are like, well, I don't mind if they cheat a little bit. It's like if you go to a hospital and you say, are you the doctor who cheated a little bit? Because I don't want you operating on me. Like, I want the person who was completely crazed and never came out for, you know, a party or anything like that, who sat at home and hit the books and was a complete nutcase about being a doctor. That's the person I want to have do my surgery. I don't want somebody who's like, that's no problem. You know, I'll get the notes off a website. It's like, no, you know, get away. So the Air Force expects, and this is how things work here, a pass they expect to be in the 90th percentile. So these Air Force captains, because typically they're captains who are in the missile silos, must get 90 or above to pass. Okay. Now, as far as the Air Force is concerned, 90 is not enough. Because 90% with a nuclear missile, it's like, what? You know, like 1% would be bad. Like 1% missed would be bad, a bad 1%. Because we just have one guy who's like, oh yeah, it's the red button, I forgot, yeah. You don't want that. So the Air Force will not promote you or reward you. They won't give you a job, they won't give you a raise unless you get 100% on these tests. So every month you have to score 100% on these tests because 90% is considered to be a bare pass. In other words, it must be perfect. On the other hand, how likely is that really? Because the books that they have to study from are 3 or 4 inches thick. They're binders of material. And there are 5 or 6 of these binders. And they have to know all this stuff. And the questions are given by previous missileers. So they're designed by engineers who know the systems. So this is not a giveaway. It's not a multiple choice easy thing. So they give a launch officer, typically designs these exams, and this is what they give. So I give you one here. This is an example. Here's an example of one of the questions. An EMT team, which is an electromechanical team, maintenance team, consisting of enlisted missile maintainers, has penetrated LO3 and LO5, these are silos, to clean a clogged drain in a sump system after a big spring storm. So it's coming, right? Spring is actually going to come. It's been 15 minutes since your last authentication with the team, and you receive a seismic alarm in LO4. Okay, so a seismic alarm means something's happened. It could be an earthquake, it could be the launch of a rocket, it could be a rocket coming in, you don't know, but something's happened at one of the silos. After referencing launch facility faults, what will you do? Declare a security situation, contact FSC, Flight Security Controller, and have him get 2 authentications from the security guards, contact LO5 and get 2 authentications from the EMT team, contact MMOC, which is the Missile Maintenance Operations Control. Okay? One of these is the correct answer. To get one wrong means you're not in 100%. If you're not at 100%, the Air Force will not promote you out of the missile base, which is probably what you want, because very few people choose this duty. The people answering these questions are not volunteers. They were assigned this score. The Air Force's unofficial motto on this stuff is, perfection is the standard. Well, if perfection is the standard, then cheating is the coping skill. And so indeed, they've discovered a cheating ring at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana in January, this past January, 2014. Of 190 missileers, 40 were accused of cheating outright. Another 52 knew there was cheating and didn't say anything. While the Air Force was busy cleaning house, they also came across a drug ring. But you know, you don't have to worry too much about it because it wasn't heroin. It was mostly weed and ecstasy. And it turned out this drug ring covered 4 different American bases and 1 RAF base. So they were just, getting a little happy because of the dull and difficult job. All right, well then, that's not so great. So then at Barksdale Air Force Base, which has its own history, in August 2013, so going back a year, the 341st Missile Wing failed its simulated run of a Minuteman III launch. So they just fail. When they get a failure like that, typically what they do is they take all the launch crews out and just get rid of them. Like they just move them on to another base, they retrain, that's the idea. Or they kill them, we don't really know. But we probably retrain them. So if you thought they were asleep on the job, check this out. They weren't asleep on the job. It's these people who are asleep on the job. So what you're looking at here is a blast door at the bottom of a silo. And these blast doors, as you can see, are about 20 inches thick, and they must be closed. In this case, they were left open because one guy decided to have a nap, and the other one decided he was hungry, and so he ordered some food from an on-site vendor. So they have, basically there's a canteen on these Air Force bases, and he ordered some pizza, and he left the blast doors open so the guy could deliver his pizza. Now, I know, right? You're thinking, but that just sounds like Rez, Unfortunately, or fortunately for us, you're not sitting at the bottom of a nuclear silo that have 10 missiles nearby, all of which are between 170 and 335 kilotons. Now, if you think about, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs were 23 and 15 kilotons each. So these missiles alone, each one of them is 10 to 20 times the size of those missiles, times 10. So it's basically 3 megatons worth of stuff. Well, okay, that was just this one pair of idiots. But we've had other worrisome issues. For instance, in August of 2007, August seems to be a bad time for the nuclear missileers. In August of 2007, a nuclear weapons-loaded bomber was flown from Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota to Louisiana. Now, this thing actually had a full load of armed nuclear weapons on it. It wasn't just a B-52, which I'll show you. Here's a B-52. Here are the pylons. Okay, now on these pylons we see here air-launched cruise missiles, which are typically nuclear-tipped. In all, the planes flew over the continental United States without permission. They were off-grid for 36 hours total, where basically they just disappeared. Now, the thinking is that they probably were going to fly to Iran. Now, this is at the very end of the Bush presidency, and the suspicion is that they really were on their way to an overflight of Iran, so a nuclear bomber, fully loaded, and so on. The overall story now, according to the Air Force and the Defense Sciences Board, is of mission exhaustion, that people just lose track, they get tired. They're dealing with nuclear weapons, but you can't be on all the time. The long-term disappointment, though, about these nuclear weapons is that if you're a nuclear missileer, you're not going to get to use your weapons because they're too big, they're too dangerous, they ruin the environment, and so on. So this is a real problem. And will trigger a 27-minute war and basically be the end of the world. So this is a sunset job, as they say, where promotions are rare and can only be achieved by getting 100% on these tests. So this is the first screen of perfection that I want to deal with. The second one is, the second screen has on it a child. Now, this is not anybody's child, just anybody's child. This second child is not a young man. He's a boy. He's a kid. He's a 15-year-old. And let's go back. Let's go back to 2001, September 11th, and let's go back to 2001, September 12th. After the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and part of Pennsylvania, the land in Pennsylvania was bombed basically by planes. How scared was the United States? If you measure fear by the amount of anger it produces, which is usually a good measure, because typically when we get scared, we get angry. Very, very few people get scared and just stay scared. We get angry, we get enraged, and the hatred begins and so on. And if we measure how scared we were, we can see, well, we abrogated civil rights as fast as we possibly could to get safety. It still takes about a half an hour extra to get onto an airplane in case somebody's carrying something that might be something, and so on. We submit ourselves to transport security, so the agencies, pat-downs, rub-downs, whatever, various different kinds of cavity searches and, backscatter x-rays and so on. Very, very scared, in other words. That's how scared we are. And Canada was very scared, too. One of the ways we can see how we're doing as a people is to see how we behave in the clutch. It's easy to behave well if you've got lots of stuff, and you're like, here, have some of my stuff, and people are like, oh, that's so nice of you. It's like, oh, it's Christmas, everybody should have something, and I'll take something I'll take something I don't need out of my cupboard and give it to you, and that's great. So it's great to be Oprah when you have stuff to give away. But what about when you have nothing and when you're terrified? Now, really, this is when we should judge how we are as people, how we are as human beings. It looks like under the guise of what the Bush White House called the global war on terror, the West, specifically America and Canada, went to war with Islam during these two wars. Well, actually, we just went to Afghanistan, but North America overall and the Allies went to war in Iraq and Afghanistan for the last 13 years. How did we do with the most fragile, the most delicate cases? It was a perfect process after all. In this particular case I'm talking about, Omar Khadr, a 15-year-old apparent combatant. He was a Canadian boy, child, who had been working with an al-Qaeda camp. That's the argument. And apparently he threw a grenade and killed a Special Forces, a Delta Force soldier who was coming in. Everybody makes much of the fact that Delta Force soldier was a medic as well, so they say he killed a medic. It's actually, this was also his operation, his specialty. But he really was a soldier first. Okay, so what happened with Omar Khadr? He was also shot 3 times, and he'd been filled full of shrapnel because they dropped bombs on him, and so he wasn't in very good shape. In fact, it's amazing that he survived. Okay, so here's how you begin to handle this kind of issue. What do you do when you have people who you don't really want to deal with, but you want to get information from them? First, you learn what little you could from what worked in Vietnam, because not much stuff worked in Vietnam. First of all, you don't declare a war. So you don't declare wars when you're fighting, say, in Afghanistan, because you're fighting non-state actors. So you're fighting al-Qaeda, you're fighting the Taliban, whatever. And you use a label that anybody who attacks an American is an unlawful combatant. So that's the first thing you do. This term doesn't appear anywhere in the Geneva Conventions. The next thing you do is you get your legal department to repeal the Geneva Conventions in your country. The third thing you do is refuse to keep any prisoners in the United States. So you make sure that you keep prisoners in dark sites in Europe, which is the places that are unknown in Europe, in Holland for a while, in Norway, we think, in Germany, in France, and so on. And on nameless prison ships, this is really a nightmare. These are prison ships that just don't dock. They're out there, and their people are in prison in them, and we have no idea where they are, but we're keeping people on these prison ships. Or in Cuba, in Guantanamo Bay, at the naval base there. Because the thinking is that if they're not on United States soil, then they can't soil the United States, basically. They can't make the United States dirty because they're not on United States dirt. The fourth thing you do is you refuse to charge any of the inmates with crimes. So you just hold them. You can hold them for years in this case, because after all, they're not subject to any laws as far as you're concerned. And you question them for as long as you wish and with any techniques that you wish. The fifth thing you do is release people without charge or explanation. So if you're going to get rid of them, you just let them go. You're like, here, go home. And they're like, well, okay. So you fly them home to their home government, which may torture them further. Now comes the addendum for the Canadians, because so far I've been talking about what Americans have done. If it's Omar Khadr, one of the not prisoners of war, who is a child, you refuse to petition the American government, whether it's a liberal government or a Harper government, doesn't matter, to work for the return of our child. So we don't ask for Omar Khadr back. And we repeatedly refuse our country's wishes, so that the governments repeatedly, the country says, we've got to get this kid back, and we, as the government, say, no, this is not of interest to us. We've asked the United States, and they say they're dealing with him well, they're treating him properly, and so on. The seventh thing is the first time you have access to your child prisoner, what would you do? You might say, well, let's take the mother, or let's take one of his sisters so he could visit with her, or let's take a doctor, let's say, maybe a psychiatrist who also has medical training, and say, how are you doing? How are you feeling? And, like, what's going on? How about that? Or you take somebody from the diplomatic corps. Like, what about that? Take somebody who can say, how are you being treated? How are things going? Or you could choose option D, CSIS, which is what we did. So we sent the Canadian security system, our Canadian Security Agency, which is the equivalent of the CIA and the FBI rolled into one. And what CSIS did was went to Guantanamo, and for 4 days they interrogated Omar Khadr at age 16. And this was an illegal interrogation, which we decided later on, but it didn't stop it at the time. Finally, we regretfully repatriate this child only when threatened by the United States government. So the United States government says, look, you got to take this kid back from us because we are done with him. He's out of our hands. What we have to remember here is that even when we were dealing with the Nazis after the end of World War II, we denazified, as they called it, denazified, and gave clean bills of health, especially to young people who have participated in the Hitler Youth, or, for instance, in the most famous case, probably like Traudl Junge, Hitler's last personal secretary, who were deemed youthful fellow travelers. In other words, they were too young to know better. They were just taken, they were swept along. They knew this is just what the culture was doing. You know, she was just getting a job, going to work for Hitler in the bunker. It was just a good job for her. And basically it worked, so why not? So this is how you handle problems that you've got perfectly. Okay, so here we have a slide which is from the U memo to Gonzalez, where you say we conclude that the treaties of Geneva do not protect members of the Al-Qaeda and Taliban militia. And you include in that anybody who you find fighting you. So that's the end of that. Geneva Conventions don't apply. No thanks. The next thing you do is say, well, in August of 2002, what if we want to get information for these people? Can we torture them? Like, how much is torture? And torture is defined here by the United States government as physical pain amounting to torture must be equivalent in intensity to the pain accompanying serious physical injury such as organ failure, impairment of bodily function, or even death. So basically, you can pretty much do anything you want. Okay. If you do anything you want and you're avoiding Geneva, what does the world make of that? And what happens if one of our people is taken prisoner? Can they be tortured?
JTF Guantanamo's mission is to detain enemy combatants and then to gain intelligence from them to be able to win the global war on terrorism. And so we are detaining these enemy combatants in a humane manner that is appropriate to that, and in accordance as much as we can with the Geneva Convention. We work very hard to ensure that the detainees are maintained and detained in this manner.
But what's wrong with the Geneva Convention? Why can't that be applied?
The detainees who are here that are being held by JTF Guantanamo are enemy combatants, and by the decision of the government, are provided only portions of that coverage by the Geneva Convention. But we are maintaining them and detaining them in a humane manner, as much accordance with the Geneva Convention as possible. We're in the business of winning the global war on terrorism. We also conduct ourselves as Americans always do. Everything that goes on in Camp Delta is a representation of what we think makes America great.
On some occasions, the interrogators brought barking dogs into the interrogation room while my head was covered with a bag. The bag was wrapped tightly around my neck, nearly choking me and making it hard to breathe. This terrified me. On other occasions, interrogators threw cold water on me. Several times, the soldiers tied my hands above my head to the doorframe or chained them to the ceiling and made me stand like that for hours at a time. Because of my injuries, particularly the bullet wounds in my chest and shoulders, my hands could not be raised all the way above my head, but they would pull them up as high as they thought they could go, and then tie them there.
I knew his lead interrogator consider him a friend. And I personally never saw him cross the line of what was acceptable at Bagram. Unfortunately, though, what was acceptable at Bagram at that time was an outrage on human dignity. It was.
I'm on my arms. I'm all old. You say this healthy. No. He said it's healthy. I can't move my arms. I requested medical for a long time. He doesn't know anything about it.
No, I mean, they look like they're healing well to me. You know, I'm not a doctor, but I think you're getting good medical care.
No, I'm not. You're not here.
The first guy who's talking is General Miller, who ran Guantanamo, as they call it, Gitmo, and began the process there in Camp Delta of basically how they kept the soldiers and how they kept the detainees and the way they tortured them, the way they treated them. He was then moved to Abu Ghraib, which is probably one of those sort of deep ironies of the system, and he replaced Janis Karpinski, who was the one who took the fall for the abuses at Abu Ghraib, which you see the pictures from here. So the pictures that you see when Omar Khadr is talking, or it's actually not him talking, it's somebody reading his script of his deposition, are the pictures, famous pictures that came out of Abu Ghraib of the way that Americans were treating prisoners in, and the point about all this is that what the American forces said, especially about the military police, military intelligence, was this was just a few bad apples. But actually, no, it turned out that this was, as Errol Morris has called it, and as the military later called it, standard operating procedure. This is the way things worked. Short shackling prisoners, shackling prisoners to beds, putting women's underwear over their heads, telling them that the underwear is, these are Muslim men, telling them that they, first of all, were wearing women's underwear, second, that the underwear had menstrual blood on it, which is a complete phobia for a Western man in general, I would suspect, as well. You can imagine people going, oh my God, not that, anything but that. It's like, oh, whatever. Except for, of course, people who get off on it, but that's another thing entirely. You always have to include everybody. So what we have here is a way of torture which is normalized, and it's become the perfect system of working. It isn't sufficient to put this on 24's Jack Bauer, although it's tempting, and especially Kiefer Sutherland, who's supposed to be a Canadian, or was supposed to be a Canadian, and his father, who did so many good films, and there's Kiefer Sutherland, who, shame on him. I mean, he should be donating all of his money to Amnesty International or Doctors Without Borders or something for his awful role in 24, where every time they torture somebody, they torture somebody for 2 minutes, the person screams and goes, the bomb's under the bed. You're like, fantastic, this torture thing really works. And people are like, yes. So when they did about 4 years ago, I gave a paper, and at the point I was talking about torture at the time, and luckily for me, unluckily, the London Free Press ran a survey and they said, are you in favor of torture, yes or no? 54% yes, 48% no. The rest of them didn't know. It's like, well, that's more than whatever. It was a lot of people. It's like, how did you get these points, these numbers anyway? So, and then the next question for the day was basically, should Tim put his head in the toilet and flush it? It's like, yes, just flush your head down the drain, because this is the world we live in now, where apparently the majority thinks it's okay to torture. And the same thing is true with Catherine Bigelow's Zero Dark 30, where interrogation appears to be a perfect system. And then torture, no matter how light it is deemed by the torturers, it's always the torturers who say, well, that's not really torture, is one of perfect failure, because that's what's come about. It's made relentlessly unsuccessful in delivering information that can be made into actionable intelligence. The one thing we don't get out of torture is intelligence we can use. So why do it, apart from the fact that there are just a few moral issues around this thing? As usual, it was the poor in Afghanistan, the poor in Iraq, the poor in America who were forced to go to war basically because this is the best deal they could get in terms of getting a job, and in Canada, who paid the price for being near to Geneva as they could be. Well, near isn't close enough. The third screen I'm going to talk about today is the perfectibility in the eye. And we heard about Virilio and Paul Virilio, and this is the whole concept of this issue of if you can see it, you can kill it. The faster we can see, the faster we can kill. This last screen that I'm talking about is composed of itself 65 different screens. If you're not familiar with drones, what are sometimes called UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, then let's remember what these things are. They're basically strange duck-like birds that can be in the air they have long wingspans, which allows them to glide and stay in the air for between 12 to 30 hours generally. The Global Hawk can stay up for a couple of weeks. Some can stay up for months. During the invasion of Iraq in 2003, the military conducted a handful of drone missions. Today, now this is a couple of years ago, I'm quoting you here from a Rolling Stone article which is fairly famous about drones. The Pentagon deploys a fleet of 19,000 drones. 19,000. There are more drones now in the American Air Force than there are planes. So let's give you an idea of, the Air Force looks big, the drones are bigger. American drones, I'll go on quoting here, have been sent to spy on or kill targets in Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Syria, Somalia, and Libya. In his first 3 years, Obama, who of course, we all hoped that Obama would be a little bit better than Bush, unleashed 268 covert drone strikes, 5 times the total of George Bush ordered during his 8 years in office. All told, drones have been used to kill more than 3,000 people designated as terrorists, of course. They all are, of course, including at least 4 US citizens without trial. So they were just killed. In the process, according to the human rights groups, they have also claimed the lives of more than 800 civilians. Obama's drone program, in fact, amounts to the largest unmanned aerial offensive ever conducted in military history. Never have so few killed so many by remote control. which is true if you think about the atom bomb or the atom bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. People actually had to be there to drop the bomb, so it wasn't remote control. Keep in mind that these dates, these numbers I'm giving you are 2 years old, and they've only increased since then. The drone mission then is as connected to the Enlightenment project of reason over emotion as any of the others I've been talking about today. What we're looking at here is a world where perfection comes out of our belief, the belief of the Western heritage of the Enlightenment, that reason is the best thing we do. It brings us over emotion and shows us the way forward. It shows us how to create laws. It shows us how to govern ourselves. It controls and seeks to control life through screens to transcend human ability by assigning what are called the dull, the dirty, and the dangerous jobs, in this case, to machines. The mission has remained one of information. Although we've armed drones, and drones have become killers, and there are some combat drones which are being released, and they are flying, and they have flown in Iraq, the main issue has been information dominance. And this has been useful, so says the military, then if some information is good, lots of information is going to be better. The United States is, after all, what it calls into full spectrum dominance. Full spectrum dominance means it controls all of the spectrum. It controls everything from infrared to ultraviolet, the whole spectrum. Radio waves, broadband, you name it, it's got it all, which is complete or perfect. That is, it controls the whole of the physics, basically, that we have. All of the knowledge in the world and all of the chaotic events that knowledge encompasses. So here's what this looks like.
Engineer Yannis Antoniadis designed the new sensor, known as Argus. With 1.8 billion pixels, it's the world's highest resolution camera. Argus fits inside this pod that attaches to the belly of a UAV. This image was taken 17,500 feet above Quantico, Virginia, and covers 15 square miles.
This whole image is at a very, very fine resolution. So if we wanted to know what is going on in any spot along this image, say near this building at this intersection, we can generate a moving image that shows what's going on in the area. Everything that is a moving object is being automatically tracked. The color boxes represent that the computer has recognized the moving objects. You can see individuals crossing the street. You can see individuals walking in parking lots. There's actually enough resolution to be able to see the people waving their arms or walking around, what kind of clothes they wear. And you could pick the location of where you produce these images anywhere in the entire field of view.
Antoniadis can open up to 65 windows at once and can see objects as small as 6 inches on the ground.
From even 17,500 feet, the white thing that you see flying around is a bird.
Argus streams live to the ground and also stores everything, 1 million terabytes of video a day, which is the equivalent of 5,000 hours of high-definition footage.
So you can go back and say, I would like to see what happened at this particular location 3 days, 2 hours, 4 minutes ago, and it would actually show you exactly what happened as if you were watching it live.
Unlike the Predator camera that limits field of view, Argus melds together video from each of its 368 chips to create a 1.8 billion pixel video stream. This makes it possible to zoom in and still see tremendous detail. Argus may be mounted on an armed UAV like the Predator, a long-range platform like the giant Global Hawk, or a development craft called the Solar Eagle that may someday stay aloft for years at a time.
The U.S. Air Force right now has the ability to archive every single video that comes off of every single UAV.
Okay, so this is what we can do. You know you're in trouble when a weapon system absorbs a mythical name. You know, when they start calling weapon systems after Argus, like which is a Greek god, then you're in trouble. It's supposed to be the advanced, like you can see how hard they had to work at this, the Advanced Remote Ground Unattended Sensor. That's really called Argus. And the Argus, if you remember Argus, let's just look at the history for this little minute here. It may be some consolation to remember that in the Greek history of Argus, Hera put Argus to guarding Io. And, okay, well, that didn't work out so well because Hermes came and slew Argus. And Argus was supposed to have 100 eyes. He's said to be the all-seeing. And so what Hera did was she tore out all his eyes and put them on the peacock's feathers, which is why we have eyes on the peacock's feathers. So, you know, there's the happy end to that particular story. You can imagine that happening here too, you know, where they just tear out all our eyes and put them on the peacock's feathers and say, see how well it ended. These three screen stories I'm talking about today, of Air Force officers unable to control the apparently flawless nuclear system they're supposed to control, of countries willing to torture for worthless intelligence, including us, and the concept of perfect if inhuman vision, illustrate our savage and often near-fatal attachment to perfection and to high scores in what we insist on seeing as some kind of game, apparently, in which the person who has the most kills is always the winner. If we believe we can achieve perfection, we go on developing such tools and pursuing these inhuman goals. We also need to remember that the first person who dies in the kill screen is us, the player character. Thank you.